Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gerard Dawson, and thank you for listening to the EdTech Startup Show. Tonight, I am happy to be on the line with Phil Cutler, who is the CEO of Paper, formerly known as GradeSlam. Phil is a student turned teacher turned entrepreneur, as he says on his Twitter profile, and he's focused on educational equity and leveling the playing field for all students. And he's been working on this through his company, Paper. And Paper is an educational support system for innovative school districts, and they are leading the remote learning movement. So, Phil, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Gerard, for having me. I appreciate it and appreciate all our listeners for joining in and sharing their ears.
Yeah, well, as we were just talking about, you have a lot going on with your company, and there's a lot happening right now. We're talking in March 2020, when we're right in the middle, really, of the coronavirus crisis, I guess, around the world. But and I want to get into that a little bit and how actually your company is, like you said, leading the remote learning movement. But first, you just had some big news, which for people who may recognize your previous company name, GradeSlam, that might be news to them. So can you tell us about just the big recent events with your company?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think what we're referring to is rebrand from our company, formerly known as GradeSlam, to Paper. So that's something that obviously we've been working on for a while and then publicly announced this week, along with our most recent funding, which was a $7.5 million round led by Reach Capital, who some of our listeners may know as a very well-known, very established educational technology venture capital fund.
Yeah, and congratulations on that. I read a little bit about it. So was your thinking a little bit about moving away from the idea of grades in the GradeSlam name?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the background on the rebrand actually stems from a number of different things, but ultimately, we had outgrown the name GradeSlam. It positioned us in a very specific way that we wanted to be positioned in the early days of the company. It was novel. I think the brand itself was relatively playful, and that resonated with some of our customers and users in the early days. The truth is that the company's evolved, education's evolved, and where we're at today is not where we were 5.5 years ago when the business started. And because of that, we need to come up with a plan, with a name, with sort of a whole different approach to how we're looking at the market and what our product is. And GradeSlam was so well known for the live help, for being online tutoring. And for a long time, that was really sort of how we were identified. And the business has just evolved so much, right? We've come a long way from being an online tutoring service to what we are now, which is an educational support system that really helps schools operate. So all in all, what we needed to do was come up with something that better embodied that was a stronger, more bold name that we felt really represented where we saw things going. And that's been a process. Obviously, a rebrand of this magnitude takes an enormous amount of time. We went through many different renditions. We worked with branding agencies, and we're quite happy with where things ended up. But obviously, it's a big undertaking for any business. So my recommendation is to avoid it if you can. But I'm quite happy, and I really think it's the best decision, one of the best decisions we made as a business for sure. Still in the early days.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine the kind of, all the ideas that get thrown out there and debating what can seem like either minutia or is this, colors and word choices and all that. But yeah, so it's cool to hear your thinking behind that. But so now kind of getting into you and some of your perspectives, as I mentioned to you before, it was interesting to we've talked briefly online before, and I appreciate how you basically share your perspectives on education, but also the business of EdTech openly. And especially compared to some other scenes, I guess, in the startup world, I don't see as much of that happening. So I'm always appreciative when you share your perspective. And so, like I mentioned, we're in this really unique time that you and I just happen to be talking, where the coronavirus is spreading and schools are shutting down. And as a reaction, several edtech companies, a lot actually, have either made special offers like suddenly making their product free or reducing prices or other things of that nature. And you had an interesting thread on Twitter about the idea of edtech products, companies suddenly making their product free, and basically how that should be maybe a point for them to pause and reflect. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what you said and also your perspective on edtech companies pricing freemium and how they're serving schools and students?
Absolutely. I think this is a topic that definitely needs more light, so I'm glad you're bringing this up. Essentially, where this stems from is, you mentioned it, but all of these companies that are reacting, essentially trying to elbow their way into some, to be honest, I'm not even sure. There's a number of different ways that they may be trying to generate business or something from this. But effectively, we have this coronavirus that's shutting schools down. It's disrupting the economy in ways we've never seen really in our lifetime. And the impact of that over a long term, who knows what that's going to be. From a health perspective, the numbers don't look great, but from an economy perspective, we've already seen huge impacts, right? And what's happened is all of these companies have tried to elbow their way into the conversation with schools, saying, hey, we're a remote learning tool. We're offering ourselves for free. Usually it's, $200 a month, but now it's free. And so to me, that poses a question, which is, why are you offering your service, which, carries a value, right? And pricing is tied to perceived value, which is something that I think a lot of people don't understand, right? Mm-hmm. Pricing is tied to perceived value. So if you're now offering your product for free, is that because people don't see any value in it? Is it because, these customers, they don't actually need this perhaps, and they're not willing to pay for it? So now you're offering it for free. If your business is doing that to acquire customers, like a freemium product, that's perfectly fine, but that's a business model decision. So to have a knee-jerk reaction during a time like this and say, we're going to make it free, or we're going to have a dramatic reduction in price, what you're actually doing, and you're not a freemium model, it's not built in, which by the way, I think is a fantastic business model for some edtech companies. You look at Nearpod, Newsella, there's a number of them that have been incredibly successful with premium products for teachers and then roll it up into the schools and districts. And I have no issue with that model whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But that was built into the business from day one. That was a channel to acquire customers, to build a very vocal group of users that then could champion you with your school or district. Anyway. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to gain customers that way, or perhaps get some sort of media attention that way, you're actually doing a huge disservice to your business and your brand over a long period of time. And the issue here is that, let's say your product really is quite good, but it doesn't solve a compelling problem for the district. So a few people kind of like it, but they're not really willing to pay for it. Well, now you run into the situation down the road where you can't necessarily monetize. You haven't built a business. And all of these users who have been depending on you, they're going to be left sort of high and dry when you have to shut your business down, like so many companies have had to do in the past, because they haven't been able to they haven't actually created a business. And the main thing I want to drive home here is, when we have a situation like we're facing right now, where there's going to be a recession, the economy is slowing down, pretty much grinding to a halt, you need to have the most sound business practices possible, not just in EdTech, but in general. And to me, that type of behavior is a sign of somebody who lacks business acumen and perhaps an amateur. and it's ultimately going to cost you, and it's going to be negatively impactful to schools, students, teachers, to whoever your users are. So I mean, all that to say, I think that there's been a little bit too much in the Twitter world or edgy Twitter around, hey, let's put together these lists of tools that are offering themselves for free during coronavirus and during school closures. If these products were so valuable and necessary, why did it take this for them to, for this to be brought to the forefront? Anyway, I think I've made my point, but it's really concerning, and it does far more damage than it does good in the long run.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, and I appreciate the enthusiasm. I didn't mean to get you fired up just a couple minutes into the conversation, but I appreciate the the perspective, because I think there is this free has a very unique place in the education world. So I think it's important to not just accept that as a given when running an education business. So anyway, it's interesting to bring this up and to be again talking to you at this time, because even as your company's description says, it says, leading the remote learning movement, which is basically getting more and more relevant. So just actually skipping ahead to something I think is a nice lead up here. Your company is uniquely positioned as it's kind of already set up for a situation where more people are going to be, or more students are going to be learning from home, but also just needing more support. So I did want to ask about, basically how you came to the idea for the company. So it sounds almost like a teacher or a school's dream, right? Like if only we could get extra help, like right when we needed it. So I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your story of recognizing the problem and then how that led to your company.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You mentioned it earlier. I'm a student turned teacher turned entrepreneur. And really early on in my teaching career, I recognized pretty interesting opportunity where my students obviously were, I had a number of students who would go out and they were hiring private tutors, right? And I was doing private tutoring like a lot of number of teachers will do to supplement their income. And I realized that the students who I had in my class who were going out to get extra help and the ones who I was tutoring were rarely the students who needed the help the most. Those students couldn't afford to get the help that they needed. They didn't have the resources at home. And when I thought about it a little bit deeper and looked into the market, I said, well, there's a ton of tools, a ton of resources out there for all these families. And, by my estimates, it represents 10 to 20% of our student population who can afford to pay for a private tutor or some sort of academic support, whether that's going to a homework help club or a Kumon, whatever it may be. But there's really nothing that was addressing the needs of the students who needed this help the most, that other 80 to 90%, who couldn't necessarily afford it themselves. And so the opportunity that I recognized was, hey, if we can find a way to be able to deliver that support, that same type of support that the wealthier families are paying for, if we can do that for everybody else, we're not only solving a compelling problem, which is huge in terms of building a business, but there's also an incredible impact piece to this as well when it comes to leveling the playing field and this notion of educational equity. In any case, that was really, to me, the opportunity was so compelling and so meaningful. I left teaching to start the business 5.5 years ago, coming up on 6 years actually, really with that North Star, this idea of delivering true educational equity. Over that time, the product, the service, that has evolved, and that will continue to evolve. Our market, our customers, they dictate where that heads. But the mission that guides us, what wakes us up every morning and brings us to work and keeps us committed, is really this idea of delivering true educational equity, and that's sort of our North Star.
Right. Yeah. And so I know you mentioned a few times now about the evolution of the business, and at least part of it, you help students when they need help, right? Is that a fair oversimplification?
No, I mean, that a huge piece of what we're doing is providing that personalized support for all students when they need it. Our live help is available 24/7. We cover all subjects, and there's no wait time, right? A student needs help. They basically click on the class that they're studying in. We take the rostering data from the school, and right away they're matched with a live educator who's able to help them with that material. So it's a big part of what we do, and it's truly personalized, right? You're working one-on-one with an educator, so that's somebody who you have their attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So, you've had experience as a teacher, and now you're getting all of this usage data from students and from the teachers on your platform. I'm wondering about how you more or less try to maximize or guarantee quality of the learning experience. And I ask that because, anyone who's been in a classroom or like both of us have worked or work as teachers, we know how personal relationship does play a role in learning. And so I'm wondering how you kind of have created your business and the service aspect of it. How do you try to kind of maximize that instructional moment between the teacher and the student?
Yeah, really, really good question. So what we've done is a number of things. First, the student is coming to us and their interaction is with paper. It's not necessarily with a particular tutor. So they're not choosing who they work with. They're being matched with the best available person to answer their questions in that moment. And we do that through a matching algorithm that takes into account a number of things. And we try to build a bit of a learning profile on the student and a teaching profile on the educator. So that plays a role in terms of how the connection is made. And our tutors, our educators, are all trained to follow Socratic teaching principles. So really they're there more to coach the student and guide them. They'll instruct when necessary, but the intention there is to actually be more supportive of the student and help them arrive at the understanding through their own sort of learning, right? The student is going to, with the guidance of the educator, figure this problem out. Anyway, all that to say, what we try to do is make sure the student is supported and not necessarily building that relationship, which they'll have with their classroom teacher. And we're not by any means trying to replace that. We're there to be more of a support tool for that student. And I'll throw this in as an aside. When we originally launched, this goes back many years, we had video conferencing, the way that somebody would use Zoom or WebEx or Skype. We actually developed very unique sort of novel software using WebRTC with HTML5 that allowed the students to communicate right through the browser, so you didn't have to download anything. Anyway, once we built this, released it to the students, we got all this feedback. We saw students coming online, they would disable their camera and they were just messaging with the tutor. And we thought this was strange behavior at first. But then when we started speaking to our focus groups and getting into it a little bit deeper with the students, we recognized the fact that they were so accustomed to interacting with their friends, with their peers, with their family through an instant message, that it was so natural to them to speak to someone who was effectively a stranger online, as opposed to being seen or seeing some stranger, which was somewhat uncomfortable. So when we actually stripped that functionality away and made it a little bit more, it took away the synchronous nature, so it was a little bit more asynchronous, where you're going back and forth by instant messaging, the students immediately became more comfortable and our engagement went up. So they're kind of looking for that. And that's maybe not necessarily intuitive to everybody. It certainly wasn't to me.
Right. Right. Yeah. Excuse me. That's a fascinating observation. And it's always interesting when anyone, adults, be it teachers or, entrepreneurs, make a guess more or less about. So you were totally right about the student support need and their students' willingness to interact. And then you made this adjustment based on the mode of communication. And I've noticed a similar thing when, asking my students to maybe go record themselves on video, or even as simple as some students will prefer to write me a quick chat message on Google Docs or something, as opposed to raising their hand, in front of the class. So it's really interesting how you identified kind of the best preferred communication method for students. And so that actually leads me to something that I imagine there's plenty of funny interactions that have happened, on the paper platform. But through researching for our conversation, I was reading an article, I believe it was in the LA Times, when they interviewed you, and I'll try to get the quote as close as it was here. He said, basically talking about the usage trends, saying Sunday at 10 p.m., so end of the weekend, late at night, is a different story in terms of usage. All the students who procrastinated are online. So I wanted to ask, there has to be some interesting insights in all that usage data, or maybe a cool or interesting example of the impact of paper on a student. What are some things that stand out to you that you know from seeing kind of behind the scenes of all these many interactions that happen?
Yeah, no, I love that. We always use that statistic because it's we can all relate to procrastinating, whether it was when we were students, but even our professional lives, everybody does it. So we obviously collect a lot of data on the interactions because our scheduling of the educators. So our educators are employees. It's not an Uber model. It's not a marketplace. They don't just choose to come online. They're actually given a schedule, and their lifestyle is basically an alternative career for a classroom teacher. So they're comp similar, and the difference is that they're working remotely from home and they're teaching virtually. And so we need to be able to staff when demand peaks and obviously reduce our staffing when it's more quiet. And this is one of the very first insights. We have a research and development arm within the business. One of their very first things that they uncovered when they started looking at usage data was how Sunday evening between 10 o'clock and midnight, depending on which time zone you're in, had the highest usage of the week. Yet Friday in the afternoon and evening dropped down to practically zero. And so we realized the last thing a student is thinking on Friday when they finish their school week is to go home and jump online and do their homework or work with a tutor. They're thinking it's the weekend. But they put all of that, that work off until Sunday evening. So that was one of the first things that we had sort of unpacked when we were doing this. And obviously over the years, we've gotten quite good at predicting what demand is going to be. But that part of the trend never really changed. When you ask though about some stories, so we have obviously there's been millions of interactions on the platform over the years, and we actually do a really good job of digging into some of the really interesting ones with our customers to try and understand a little bit better the story behind why a student is behaving a particular way. When they're coming online, last year we actually had a student who used us 380 times, so more than once a day. So wow. We thought that was a really interesting. I mean, that's obviously uncommon for someone to be that engaged, but this was a student who was actually traveling, and they were studying remotely, and this was their main source of support. But my favorite story when it comes to all this, we had a student who was one of our districts in California, and she had recently moved to the district, and she was a freshman in high school, so 9th grade, and was relatively disengaged from her learning, right? And you can imagine there's a lot of things going on when you're a freshman in high school, and now you've moved to a new community. So you're out of your element already, and you're in this new school. There's a lot of things coming at you. It's also, you're maturing as a human. Anyway, so she had been using back then Grade Slam, but now paper, quite regularly. And we do something every year that we call our Tutor Choice Awards. And this is when our tutors have a really, really powerful or meaningful interaction with a student, and we feel the student worked hard and the tutor wants to recognize that student for their hard work. Anyway, we don't know any of the background on these stories, right? The tutor has a great session and they say, hey, I want to nominate this student for a Tutor Choice Award. We end up sending the award to the school, and they present to the student. It's a nice recognition for the students. we send it for this girl who had this fantastic session, that had been using the platform quite regularly. And a few days later, we get this email from her teacher. The teacher says, "You won't believe this, but that student has not spoken once in class the entire school year. She was completely disengaged, socially withdrawn, and really struggling from an academic perspective." She got recognized in front of all of her peers with this award, which, from our perspective, we're very happy to recognize the students, but, we don't know them personally. So we don't know how this is going to impact somebody. We just want them to know, like, hey, we're proud of the hard work you're doing.
Right.
She was recognized. And the next day in class, she spoke for the very first time. She actually put her hand up and answered a question. By the end of the week, she had been engaged far more. So the impact that we were having went far beyond what was just the academic interaction that she had with one of our educators. Because of the recognition she had received, she had become more engaged in her learning, more engaged obviously in her classes, and hopefully more engaged socially in everything that was going on. So to me, that's a really powerful example of how the academic support piece is only really one piece of this puzzle that's going on. Confidence is such a key in being successful, not just in school, but in everything that you do in life. So I love that story because I really think it recognizes how educational equity is really such an impact beyond the four walls of the classroom.
Yeah, and any teachers will recognize that situation where part of the value I see of paper is that you're providing this new avenue for students to engage with their work when, like you've said, so many other factors may get in the way of students engaging or feeling they can be present in their physical classroom. And so through this student having that other way of approaching their work and gaining confidence, then they were able to transfer that. That's like the elusive educational term, transfer. They could transfer that to the physical classroom. Yeah, that's awesome. So we're talking about the kind of the model of paper and now these specific impact examples, which are cool to hear. I'm interested again about your business perspective, and that's your decision to basically sell your company's service and product to schools and districts as opposed to parents. So you've touched on your mission and your value and work towards educational equity. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your decision to not be a consumer product, and even I'm wondering conversations with investors, if they understand why you're going this route, or if you've had ever internal conversations about opening things up. I'm just curious about the model.
Yeah, great question. Honestly, spot on. So for us, we are exclusively B2B play, right? We sell almost exclusively to public school districts, although we do have some independent and charter schools. Our main market are public school districts. And I'll say the main reason for that, it really does come down to this equity piece, right? That in our eyes, in order to be able to support all students and level the playing field, you really do need to be able to reach everybody. And so the moment that this cost is being passed on to the consumer, right? Now all of a sudden you're being far more selective over, who's going to have access to, to the product and be able to get help. For us, that really is quite key. But I will say this. When we originally launched, we were a B2C platform for a number of reasons, but primarily that was the easiest entry point to collect data. So we would have never been able to walk into a school or a district and say, hey, by the way, can you pilot this product that no one's ever heard of, that we have no idea whether it works, and we just need to collect feedback on with like a few hundred students? That would never have gone over. So instead, we decided to start with a B2C route. really with the goal to collect as much data. And I mentioned a bit earlier the transition from video conferencing to instant messaging. That was through feedback we had with students who were using us when we were B2C. And one of the main advantages to B2C is you can easily sort of, you spend money on acquisition, but you can go up and go online and advertise to some families, and you'll get some students, right? Now the unit economics are absolutely horrible, and that's the reason why realistically we've seen very, very few online tutoring businesses in North America raise large venture capital rounds or even grow to a large scale, because you're constantly hemorrhaging money to acquire customers who are eventually going to churn. In our case, the customer and the relationship is exclusively with the school district. So when our seniors graduate, there's a new flock of seniors. We're not going back to reacquire a customer. So it really is truly a SaaS business, right? There's annual subscriptions that the school district pays, and those are renewed year after year. You're not constantly chasing. It's not a marketplace where we have to fill both sides of it. It really is a different business model. And from the conversations we've had with investors, that to them was far more compelling. And when they started to get into and dig into the unit economics of our business, the barrier to entry is incredibly high. And we had to obviously go through a lot of important learning to get to where we're at. But now that we've reached that point, it really is quite exciting to sort of see the scale at which we can have impact, and the fact that this is a true business, right? There's meaningful revenue being generated by our customers. There's students, there's teachers, there's administrators who are engaging with it. So we are solving a compelling problem for the customer. And at the end of the day, that's what the best companies do. And in our case, that meant having to pivot at a certain point from B2C to B2B, but that was many years ago. And I think there's advantages to having started that way. I think it's very, very difficult to do that. You really have to. And from day one, we always thought we were going to be a B2B tool. So we built the business that way, but it's very hard to transition from one to the other. So I find businesses who try to do both will often miss the mark on one or the other. And you'll have to have two completely separate product teams if you're doing this properly. One dedicated B2B, one dedicated B2C. Your marketing and lead gen, your narrative, everything is separate. So unless you truly have enormous scale, I think it's difficult to have both. And you're probably losing in the end, even though there may be some money sitting on the table one side or the other. Distractions within your organization, that will have a much more profound impact over time than maybe a few dollars here and there in the early days.
And just touching on one thing you said there, any lessons that you can recall learning when you made that shift? So in other words, I often talk to folks who are, a few stages earlier than you and going through the basically pain of trying to engage with school districts. When you switched from B2C towards B2B, can you remember maybe some of the realizations or, again, lessons that you gained from those first couple of years of that switch?
Absolutely. Those are etched in my memory forever. I would definitely say that from my perspective, at least, I don't come from a background in business, right? I didn't study this at university. I studied education, became a teacher. So building out the sales, customer success, and marketing piece of this whole business is completely different B2C than it is B2B. And some people have a mind for one or the other. If you're lucky, you'll have one or the other. Very few have both. And I had neither. So it required an enormous amount of learning to try and figure out, okay, how do you sort of attract customers, your customer acquisition cost and lifetime value on the B2C side, and putting those pieces together. That was a huge learning curve for me. And then all of a sudden I need to transition to, wait a second, I need an inside sales team, right? I need to be able to figure out how am I generating leads, whether they're inbound or outbound, that I can pass off from an SDR to an account executive who's then going to close that deal and hand it off to customer success, who's going to manage the account throughout the year and then hand it back to the account executive for a renewal. There's no way I could have known any of that stuff going into it. So there were a lot of bumps and bruises along the way. And to be perfectly honest, I think for me, having an open mind, and a lot of our customers, especially in the early days, were quite supportive. They realized that, maybe we didn't know everything that we thought, or maybe we should have known, or that we thought we knew. And they said, hey, this is actually the way things are done, right? Navigating them, and most of our contracts go to board approval. We actually have a couple this evening. They end up at a board approval. So, the school district has to approve. I mean, I had no idea how any of that operated. I knew from a periphery when I was a teacher that there was this board that sort of ran things. I had no idea how you get on a board. How does that approval process work? So learning to navigate that was like an entirely brand new learning experience. But once you get that down pat, you're able to repeat that. And that's what we've been able to create. And I think a big reason why investors are excited in what we're doing now is we do have a scalable, repeatable sales process.
Mm-hmm. And maybe, I'm asking from a place of ignorance to an extent here too. Did you learn that strictly through experience, or were there any resources or people or avenues that were also helping you to learn that?
So we've been really blessed to have incredible investors. Ned Renzi, who's the partner at Birchmere Ventures, he led our seed round. This is somebody who, I think is one of the most incredible investors, just the way that he supports entrepreneurs, the way he thinks. And he was always quite adamant about, you need to have coaching. You should have a CEO coach. Your directors or the other senior executives within the business, they should have coaches as well, because you don't need to have, at least, this is something that I learned. You don't need to have the answer to any of these questions or to know how to do it. All you need to do as the CEO is know where you can go to get that answer or solve that problem. And I worked with a CEO coach I continue to work with, who's become a good friend and also invested in the business. And he was quite experienced in building these organizations and coaching teams up. And then eventually we actually brought in a sales and customer success advisor who advises both a director of customer success and our director of partnerships. And his name's Chuck Kleiner, also incredible human. This is somebody who has 20, 30 years of experience selling B2B in K-12, higher ed. I mean, this is someone whose knowledge goes far beyond, anybody I know when it comes specifically to this. And so between all of these advisors, we've really been able to put these pieces together in a relatively quick manner. And I owe all that back to Ned, who was really quite adamant about everyone having support. And you don't need to know the answers. You just need to find somebody who can help you get that answer. So I strongly advise that to any entrepreneur who's listening. You don't need to be the person who has the answer to every question. Just know and have the resources, have your Rolodex of people who you can call on, and they're going to help you walk through these problems.
Yeah, I appreciate you being transparent about sharing all that. And, it might just be my narrative bias, I guess that is our desire to place things within a story, but there does seem to be this fascinating trend that I hear from talking to founders or CEOs. And I hear you explain that process and saying you need to not have the answer, but be able to find the person who has the answer. And that does have a remarkable similarity to the way paper operates for students, right? Because they don't need to be able to do all their work right in that moment on their own, but they can kind of call on the teachers on your platform to help them.
It's so true. I mean, it's not just business, right? This is everything in life. And I think you don't necessarily, no one's expecting you to know everything, right? And then, there are issues within the way we assess students that sort of expects them to have the answers. And I think that that's changing, by the way. I think that teachers have recognized the fact that, hey, like learning is more project-based. It's more putting the pieces together. That's what's going to be valuable later on in life. But you're right. I mean, on paper, we follow the Socratic teaching principles, which is, you're coming online and we're going to kind of collaborate. We're going to work together and we're going to figure this out. And there's not one clear-cut way to solve this problem. We're going to figure out what's the best way given what you know and what you need to know and the type of student that you are. And the reality is, it's the same thing as working with a coach or an advisor. Not every coach, not every advisor is going to be right for each entrepreneur. People are all different. I've had advisors over the years who, I just didn't work for me, but they were super, super successful. And then I've had ones who everything clicks. And, that's a personal preference. And the key, I think, on paper when it comes to matching the students with the educators, the tutors, is that match is as accurate as it can be right away.
Mm-hmm. So switching gears, I know you're aware of the at least from my perception, you have a general awareness of the landscape of education and EdTech in particular. And I know that you, in the relatively recent past, got investment from, I think it was Google's Voice AI initiative. So that got me thinking just about,
That's right.
With my, I won't even say her name because she'll respond back, but the voice device I have sitting next to me, the cool opportunities there are for learning. Like I have a young son, and it's so cool when we're going through something in the day, we can actually, ask a question out loud, and then we stop and listen to a quick Wikipedia snippet or whatever. And so I've been kind of keened into how voice can really be powerful in learning. So I'm curious about your perspective on this. What role you think voice tech could play in education, and then maybe if you have some in mind, any other tech trends that you feel excited about for education?
Totally. Oh, wow. Great question. So where do I start? First off, I think voice assistant technology, when it is properly applied to education, is going to completely transform the way our classrooms operate. You're going to effectively have a teaching assistant available for all our students, depending on what they're learning and what their needs are. And that to me is incredibly powerful. It also opens the door for a number of different things. Now I can talk a little bit about the background of our partnership with Google, and they've been fantastic partners too, by the way. Great company to work with, incredible product minds there. I mean, they understand product better than anybody I've ever spoken with. But for us, this all came from the foundational area that, hey, we want to provide all students with a level playing field and the educational equity that we've spoken about today. And the reality is that instant messaging doesn't necessarily work for everyone. There's limitations, right? There's a number of different categories of students, I think, that really do benefit from voice assistant technology and just voice technology in general. The most obvious of which would be young children, right? You mentioned, your own child would more likely be able to engage with one of these devices than they would be able to type. And I think, instant messaging in general, as we grew up with it and how we send a message now, for a child born today, that's going to be a different experience. They're going to be using their voice. They're going to be using, some sort of like block emoji coding and things like that to send messages. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but that's changing, right? But the voice assistant tool, if you've ever seen these videos of, a 3-year-old basically having a conversation with one of them and getting something, ordering pizza. I mean, I've seen some great videos of these kids, using the devices to get something done that there's no way a 3-year-old should be able to do this, but they can do it seamlessly. That is a huge opportunity. And that kind of, for us at least, it brings the age down. We typically operate in the middle to high school areas. fourth and fifth grade, they tend to be able to instant message well enough to use the platform, but this opens up to younger and younger audiences. So for me, that's one really big group that I think is going to be impacted by voice. The second are English language learners, right? These are, and not just English language, but any language learner really, where you may not be able to write as well as you can speak. And I know from my own experience, learning languages, you always pick up on the spoken before you're going to be able to write or type it, especially in a coherent way with an educator. So you may be able to actually have that conversation, in a language that you're learning or that you're not completely fluent in to write, but you can do it first through voice communication. And for us, that's a really big piece of the puzzle, especially if you look at some of the markets within which we operate. California, large Spanish-speaking population, a lot of English language learners. And for them, this opens the door. The last group, and I think this is a group that is, equally as important as all the others, if not more, are students that have various disabilities, whether that's a physical disability, a cognitive disability, whatever it may be, who can't necessarily type or send messages the way that, your average student may be able to. And so I love always using this example that most technology in education stems from an accommodation. It started as something that was accommodating a small group of students, and then we recognized over time, wait a minute, that's actually going to be beneficial to everybody. And I think voice assistant technology will likely start and have its impacts initially with that group as an accommodation, and then it will sort of move to these English language learners, and then eventually younger audience, and then to everybody. So that's a bit of a long-winded response, but I see huge applications for voice technology and voice assistant technology in the classroom. We're still several years away from that really hitting the way that we want it to, but we're working on it, right? I mean, this is the reason why we have this partnership. It's why Google Assistant, they made their investment in the company, was really because we want to drive this narrative forward.
Yeah, I really like that lens for understanding how innovation happens in education, and even it's cool as a predictive lens too, because that does make sense, right? There's the accommodation, and then the technology makes it either easier, faster, cheaper, more scalable, and then because that happens, then it's rolled out on in a wider capacity. That's a cool way to look at things. So yeah, I've learned definitely a lot already so far. We've been able to touch on a few different things. I know, like we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, you have a lot going on right now. And well, actually, one other thing that you could call a trend, or really just the next wave of our education system, is the concept of remote learning. So can you talk a little bit about that as maybe another trend that you see playing out over the next couple of years?
Oh yeah. I mean, everything's going remote. There's no doubt about this whatsoever. We look at what's happened in the workforce and the way that companies like Zoom and Slack have facilitated remote workforces to be able to communicate when you're on the road. Some companies now have these distributed teams. That trend is coming to education 100%. And I think the extended school closures that we're going to be facing now, and how long that may be, I'm not sure, that is going to drive this conversation forward immediately. There are districts, we work with a number of them. We have one in particular, Tustin Unified, down in Tustin, California, in Orange County. They have such an advanced perspective when it comes to remote learning. Students all have devices. They obviously have all the learning management tools necessary. The teachers are versed at teaching. They're putting all their assignments online. They're super comfortable with this. The community itself has a Wi-Fi network, so it allows everybody to get access to internet at home. And they have an ESS, they have paper for all the students. So every single student, if that district were to close, every single student there has their devices, has access at home, and has the support that they need 24/7. When people
Yeah.
realize how much of an advantage that is over a district who doesn't have those things, and how those students, if their school closes for a few weeks or a few months, those teachers are they're already prepared. They're already committed to this. The district has made that an initiative. They're going to be so far advanced, right? They're going to be way more prepared for university, for college, and then the workforce than the districts that don't have that in place, who are now scrambling to try and put these things together, which, this is a very intentional plan that has been rolled out there. And then there's a number of districts that are that forward thinking. These are the people that everyone when schools reopen and everything settles down in a few months, everyone's going to be looking to them and say, wait a minute, you guys got this right. Walk me through your plan. Give me the last 5 years of what you had to do to get to where you're at, because we need to start that today. And that is why I'm so bullish on this idea of remote learning. I think from a positioning perspective, paper could not be better positioned to really explode over the next 2, 3, 4 years, as every school is going to be trying to catch up. This narrative is only going to be accelerating. And we're proud, obviously, to work with a lot of districts that are quite progressive. We have some districts too that are just getting there, that have those plans, and we're obviously part of those plans. But it's coming to everybody, and it's going to become, to be a superintendent or an assistant superintendent in a school district, you're going to have that mindset. The training, all of that it's going to put you in a place where you're going to be able to do that. If your district doesn't have it, you're going to finish 3-year, 5-year contracts, and that's going to be in place. So I'm really excited to see where that's going to go. From my perspective, that's going to be the revolution that we need in education to get everybody online. And they always say, education, it moves at a glacial speed. That's changed. I mean, that's not true anymore, to be honest. I hate when people say that, but that's changed, and that's changing, and it's being driven by incredible leadership at the administrative level in these districts. So, and that's my take on remote learning. And I really think we're going to need more companies that are committed to this. Obviously, paper, we're leading the charge. As the first educational support system, we play a really, really important role in this. That I don't think a school can truly be remote without having an ESS. But there's going to be other tools too, right? We play one piece. We put one piece of the puzzle together, and there are a number of other tools that are going to be built over the years that will facilitate that further as well.
Yeah. So it seems like the time is right for kind of the category creation, more or less, that your company is doing, or at least a huge part of. So, Phil, just in general, I think teachers or school leaders who are listening, I think you've probably caught their ear at a few points, just from your understanding and your insights on the current needs of schools. And then on the other side, I think for entrepreneurs who are listening, or folks working for education companies, I think they've probably gleaned some valuable lessons. So I appreciate all that you've shared. And before we go, I'm just curious, in general, what's up next for paper, besides, anything that you haven't mentioned, and what's a message or a suggestion that you'd like to leave with listeners?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me on. And I think in general, everybody who is listening right now, and who follows you, obviously you're a quite vocal person within our educational technology community, and I appreciate that and commend you for doing it. I love to see teachers that are not afraid to share their point of view and go out there and go after it. So I definitely encourage everybody who's listening to pursue any of their passions and dreams. In terms of what's next for paper, I mean, we're growing quite rapidly. Touched on it earlier, but the timing is right now. I mean, this is going to be a product that's in every school, across the country and eventually beyond. And, we're hiring, very quickly. We've grown almost 50% since January, which is wild if you think about it. And so that's been a really exciting period. Some of the stuff that we're working on that's going to be really big, working on some initiatives with a lot of our partner districts and their teachers to build communities. So we've seen the impact, we've seen how powerful communities can be at facilitating the exchange of information, of knowledge between teachers, between administrators. I think teachers do a fantastic job of pushing themselves to get better. Their professional development is sort of built into them. How can you be a teacher but not want to be learning at the same time, right? And that doesn't exist in all industries, right? I think education, we really do a great job of doing that. And I think that stems from communities, right? We look at all these organizations, ISTE and all of the affiliates. Each state has their various groups. I mean, it's incredible how well organized and how impactful that those groups are. So, at Paper, we've spent a lot of time being quite intentional about what does a community look like for our educators. All of these teachers and administrators who are using the product so effectively in their class, in their teaching, in their district. How can we take those stories and share those best practices and allow everyone to learn from it? So, to hint at stuff that's coming down the pipeline, that's some of the thinking that we're, where our head's at. And I certainly encourage anybody who's an EdTech entrepreneur or teacher, if you have thoughts around that, feel free to reach out. We're always open to hearing feedback. We want to really dig in and see, how can we add the most value to to a teacher who wants to be a better teacher. And the only way that we're going to be able to develop any products or tools that are going to deliver that is by having these conversations and getting the feedback from the educators themselves. I mentioned at the beginning, we don't have to have the answers, right? I don't need to know what to do. I just need to know where to go get it. And I know there's so many smart teachers out there doing amazing things. I need to hear from them if I want to make this a reality.
All right. So teachers, you heard it here first. The little hint at the next evolution of Paper from Phil Cutler, the CEO of Paper. And if you want to check out the website, it's paper.co, paper.co. Phil, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Gerard, absolute pleasure. Love what you're doing. As I said, keep up the great work. And anybody who's interested in working at a fast-growing EdTech company, go to paper.co, check it out. We've got a careers page. We have an office in Los Angeles. We have an office in Montreal. We've got teams sort of throughout the country. So if you're looking to join a company, we'd definitely love to have you. So don't be afraid to reach out. And if you're at a district that you think could benefit from this, or you're an administrator at a district that wants to bring this, reach out right away. You can contact me directly. My Twitter is @PACutler. You can go to our Paper Twitter is @PaperLearning. We're online, paper.co. So really, we rely on the community to drive this thing forward. I think nobody can do this on an island. So I'm very thankful, Gerard, for you having me on today and everything that you and the whole EdTech community does to sort of push the innovation forward.
Sure. Well, seems like we have plenty to talk about. So hopefully we'll be able to do a round two at some point. All right.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So until next time, everybody, my name is Gerard Dawson, and this has been my conversation with Phil Cutler, CEO of Paper. And thank you for listening to the EdTech Startup Show.